All right. Well, I hope that everyone can hear me and that the recording is working here. Just check. All right. Today, we're going to be talking about this fabulous book, The Opposite of Spoiled. It's not new. It came out in 2015. This is actually my third time reading it through, and I really do still like it, although some parts of the book are feeling a little bit dated, I won't lie. Um, but the general format of the book I like a lot, although it is a little bit all over the place. It's very much a story-based, interview-based way to explore how families deal with the question of money, how families talk to their kids about money, and the evidence that supports certain ways of doing things and certain ways of not doing things. The author is Ron Lieber. He's a New York Times and former Wall Street Journal, I think, columnist, and he interviews a lot of families. Just to start again with introducing myself, I'm Dr. Marissa Caudill. If you haven't been here before, welcome. I have a website called theparentdoctor.com where if you're interested, you can sign up for the newsletter, which is free, the book club, which happens on the third Wednesday of each month at noon, also totally free. When you sign up here, you will get access to the replays through my private Facebook group, as well as an email that comes out after each event, and also access to an actionable PDF that I create from each book. So I've chosen 12 books this year that I think are relevant for parents, that give useful tips and tricks and just thought-provoking ideas. And I create a PDF that will help you kind of have the Cliff's Notes version of that to put it into place and to practice it with your family. If you sign up, you'll get access to everything from the past 6 months as well as July and beyond. In addition, I have paid courses. There's a 7-day mini course, as well as a more intensive course that you can buy on its own or with my involvement. And I'm a psychiatrist and therapist in California for any California residents who might need care for themselves or their kids. Back in April, I started a new podcast. Please check it out. The first season just wrapped up. It's 12 episodes where I talked about the 10 most common diagnoses that parents have brought their children to see me about. So that included general problems with behavior, teens who were vaping marijuana causing mental health issues, autism, anxiety, ADHD, depression, OCD, bipolar disorder, psychosis, and trauma. So if any of those topics are relevant to you or your child, please find the episode that would be of interest to you. I put resources in there for each of those diagnoses in the description show notes. And then season 2 is going to be me interviewing various parents. If you would like to be on, I would love to have you, and you can go to my website to book that call as well. And I'd like to also announce that starting this month, I began a new offering. It's very low cost. It's called Office Hours. It's a live call with me. It is not clinical care, so I'm not going to be doing any diagnosing or treating of any mental health disorders, but I am going to be talking with parents about anything and everything that comes up for them as they're caring for their kids. This August topic is going to be building character and embodying values with our kids. That's what I'll be talking about, but anyone who's on the call who has questions can submit those anonymously or live on the call, and I'll be going through those as well. You can sign up for this if you would like by going to officehours.theparentdoctor.com/sign up. Okay, so getting to this book takes a story-based approach, and it challenges the conventional wisdom of sort of shielding kids from financial matters, the idea that we don't need to talk to kids about money because they don't need to be worrying about money. And it encourages honest conversations about money starting at a very young age. Hey, Kate. It was written in 2015, so as I said, it's starting to feel a bit dated already. The key takeaways are financial literacy. It emphasizes the importance of teaching kids about money, especially our daughters. So he talks about the fact that still in this day and age, at least in 2015, sons were much more likely to be talked to their parents about things like 401ks, retirement savings, investments than daughters. Daughters were more likely to be talked to about the importance of charity and giving. So I think it's important to be aware of our unconscious gender biases as parents that still exist. Then he talks a lot about, which I love, the idea that money is really a great opportunity to discuss family values with our kids, whether these be values of patience, waiting for the thing that we want, thrift, making good financial choices, generosity, the importance of giving, perseverance, the importance of working towards long-term goals, and perspective, the ideas of have versus wants and where we fall in that. He has a lot of practical advice. We'll talk about this in a bit. His ideas about whether allowance should be something that is earned or given, savings habits, how we can reinforce that with our kids if we're able financially, how we can help our kids make good spending decisions, and how to discuss family finances. There's a lot of great stories about that I think were very impactful, made a strong impression. Still haven't done it myself. My kids are still pretty young, but I plan to. And then the importance of philanthropy, teaching kids about giving back. He discusses in the book how most kids, when they're asked, how does your family give back or how does your family contribute to your community, they don't know, even if their parents do in fact make charitable contributions of money or in kind or through volunteering. We don't often talk enough with our kids about that work and that giving. And so it's very important that we do so. So he includes a call to include our kids, not just in the conversations about it, but in the decisions that we make about charitable giving in our families. So he discusses, and we all know this, right, that kids ask tough questions when it comes to money. Things like, are we rich? Are we poor? Why don't I go to private school? Why do I go to private school? How much do you make? Why did you become a blank and not a blank? You know, why did you become a doctor and not Jeff Bezos? Will we have to move? And these are tough questions. I actually remember myself, probably I was in second or third grade riding the bus home, and my peer, I remember her name was Melissa. I don't remember her last name, but she lived in an apartment complex. She knew that I lived in a neighborhood with houses. And she called me, I remember, a rich bitch. And I went home that day and I asked my mom, like, are we rich? Like, I really had never thought about it before. And my parents stopped in their tracks and they looked at each other and they said, no, we're middle class. And I kind of laugh about that now because comparatively, I guess we were middle class. I mean, this is probably what, the early 80s when there really was a middle class. Now, as everyone knows, there's a lot more wealth divide in America. There's still a median income, which in 2024, I just looked it up, is about $70,000. So I think even at that time when I asked the question, my family's income in the 1980s was probably about $70,000. So I knew a lot of people who made more than us, but I also knew a lot of people who made less than us. And in retrospect, I don't know how I would have answered that question if I were my parents, but I know that even in their state of affairs, it caused them a lot of pause. And if my kids asked us that now, I would just tell them, yeah, we are rich, because they need to understand that comparatively, we are very rich. But my kids still know that they have lots of friends who are much richer than we are. You know, why don't we have a private jet, or why don't we go skiing on ski week? These are questions that we still have to answer, even though we ourselves are in the top 1% and we're extremely, extremely fortunate. So a lot of this book is geared towards families like mine, families that, you know, generally have more than enough. And so when we tell our kids, no, you can't have that, it's not going to be a question of because we can't afford it, as often as it's going to be an issue of because we won't let you have that. And I think that that is something that many parents do need guidance on, because it takes more fortitude to be able to tell your child, no, because I won't let you, than it does to say no because we can't afford it. Not that it's easier to say no because I won't let you. I think it's very hard to have to tell a child no because we can't afford it. And I'm sure my parents had a really hard time with that because they did have to say that quite often. But I just like the way the book is written. It's not just for wealthy families either, it's for all of us. So the importance of money conversations, again, comes because we can reinforce values that are really important to all of us, like kids being curious, generous, having patience, exhibiting thrift and making sound financial decisions, modesty, perseverance, and more, all through these conversations about money. So let's talk allowance. He devotes a good amount of the book to this. And I know it's a topic that, and he says this too, it's been debated for a long time. Like, should kids be given an allowance, or should they have to earn any money that they get? He argues, and I agree with him, that it's not necessarily bad to give your kids a modest allowance that's not tied to any chores. They still can have chores and responsibilities at home, but the allowance can just be a given. And it really should be a modest allowance. So he recommends starting this early, basically as soon as your kid knows basic math, as soon as your kid is bugging you to buy them like things in the grocery store checkout line or at Target, then you should start giving them some disposable funds to use that you can just say, well, that's your choice. If you want to spend your money on that, you can. He argues that a good amount to pay is 50 cents to $1 per year of age each week, and then give them a raise each year of 50 cents to $1 on their birthday. You should definitely make this tangible, especially for young kids. I'd say like 5th grade and under, they need to see the money. They need to be able to touch the money. So you're going to have to go to the bank and get a bunch of singles if you have a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old that you're going to be doing this for. And then in our household, we use something that looks like this. You can buy these on Amazon, like a give, save, spend money bank, where they can see it and easily access the money. And then for my older son, we actually started a little later for him. He started his allowance when he was, actually, I think he started when he was 8. And I've actually been lax. I haven't given him a raise, but he's really not interested in money. Like, I basically keep a tally for him because he was never really into the jars and seeing the cash. My daughter, on the other hand, is totally into the jars and counting her cash. So it's going to depend on your child. But my son has just like let his savings accrue, and we just have it on automatic deposit to his Capital One account from our checking account. And he has now, like at age almost 12, like close to $1,000 in there from his allowance, which is pretty great. But he only asks me about it like once a year, and every year he's like, wow. But I think we're getting to the point that we need to start even like teaching him about investments. But basically, you want to have it be something that they can use. You want them to be able to spend that money now in their spend pile, but you also want to encourage them to save. And he gives various examples through stories of parents who incentivize their kids saving in very generous ways. So not just like, employer matching where they match, the first dollar or something. He talks about a CPA who gave his kids something ridiculous, like 50% per month interest on everything under $100. And then it went down from there until it was more like 5% interest on everything under $1,000. But that would really incentivize a kid to save, but you're going to have to adjust it for your kid because you may have a kid who naturally saves who's going to bankrupt you if you incentivize them that much. And you may have a kid who naturally spends, and you're going to have to incentivize them strongly. So I think we have to take these ideas and then adjust them for our own children and their personalities. So again, this age-old question, should allowance be a given or earned? I think you can do it either way. What I would say, though, as a child psychiatrist, is that if you're going to make it something that your child has to earn, you need to understand what it is you're doing there. Psychologically, you're making that a positive reinforcement of a behavior you want to see more of, a category 1 behavior, namely them doing their chores, whatever those are. And that does then put you into a situation where you're only going to give them the allowance when they complete the chore. But if you have the expectation that they do the chore, you're kind of then in a bind because you're going to fight with them about it. Positive reinforcement is really better for things that say they go a day without hitting their sibling, or, they do their homework independently, something that's going to happen on its own and that you're not going to force them to do it. It's like their choice to do it or not do it. And you're going to reinforce that to see that behavior happening more often. If your expectation is that they do the chore, I don't think that you should give a positive reinforcement for that. I don't think it makes sense. Positive reinforcement would be akin in our lives as adults to bosses giving, say, bonuses, or your employer giving a bonus for a certain benchmark being met or something like that. So it's like, it'd be great if you can do this, but the expectation isn't that everyone will be able to do that, right? I do think, though, that we can incentivize chores and those kinds of work projects around the house more by paying our kids for it. So if you have a child who has a savings goal to, say, I don't know, buy some $100 game, and they're only earning $10 a week, and they're like, oh, I'm gonna have to wait 10 weeks. That feels like so long. And they're motivated to do more, then by all means, discuss with your spouse or co-parent whether or not it makes sense to give them the opportunity to earn a few extra bucks doing things around the house. So we don't want to discourage their wants. Instead, we want to use their wants to encourage their exploration of how they can get what they want. So this is my favorite part of the book. This story was the part that stayed with me the first time, second time, and third time too. He talks about how one of the parents in the book brought home all the income that he had from a month. It was something like $12,000 or $15,000 in cash. He went to the bank and he got all this money in cash money, and he brought it home and dumped it on the dining room table in front of his kids. And he was like, it's time for us to have a serious talk about money. This is how much I earn per month. And then literally just like whittled it away, showing the kids like, this much goes to pay the mortgage, this much goes to pay the car payment, this much goes to pay the insurance, this much goes to groceries, this much goes to karate, like whatever it was. And then the kids saw what was left over, And it put everything into perspective when the parents were telling them, we can't afford that or we can't do that this month because they saw where the money went. Now, if this makes you feel nauseous or break out in a sweat because maybe you earn a lot of money and the idea of plopping like tens of thousands of dollars on the dining room table makes you feel a little sick, you can also do this in a more general way by having like beans and say like these beans represent the cash that we have, and then showing the fraction of money that goes to different things. But I think that visual is super, super powerful for kids, and the kids of that person he interviewed, and they both remembered that day. One was like 14 and one was younger. And he talks about how we may worry that our kids are going to discuss this outside the home. But generally, like, kids are curious about it and they want to know. But once you tell them, they do kind of understand that this is a private matter. And you can express to them, like, most people don't discuss with their friends how much they make, but they do still want to know. And he talks in the book a lot about how parents often are uncomfortable answering the question, how much do you make? And how kids, especially as they reach like 13, 14, 15, are going to be curious about it. And they're going to start sleuthing and doing Google searches and make assumptions about how much you make if you won't tell them. So it's better to just be honest with them and discuss this when they are asking about it. All right, so I like this part a lot too. Thinking about wants versus needs on a spectrum. He talks about deciding and wealthy families making the decision. And again, this is not to say you have to do this, but like it's an idea to think about whether this would make sense for you. He talks about a wealthy family deciding together, even though they could give their kids designer brands, all these things, they ultimately said, okay, what we're willing to spend on like kids' bikes, kids' clothes, the things that they need for school, their backpacks and everything. We're going to draw a line, what they called the Land's End line. So whatever it would cost for, he gives the example of rain boots. Say your teenage daughter wants rain boots and she wants the Hunter rain boots that cost $100. Well, if rain boots cost $39.95 on Land's End, then that's the budget that they would give their daughter to spend. And if she wants to spend her own money to get the Hunter boots that are $100, that's her business. But ultimately, they didn't feel like it was their job as parents to meet 100% of their kids' wants. Instead, they drew a line. And I think this is helpful. Psychologically, I think as parents, it's helpful to have a line. Otherwise, you're going to be willy-nilly, and it's going to depend on the day. And in a day when you're feeling good and generous, and maybe you just got a bonus at work, yeah, go for it. Hunter boots, designer denim jeans, whatever it is. And then another day, you're going to come to your kid and say, like, be mad at them for asking for something that's expensive. So I think it's better to have a plan in place in your head from a young age of what you're willing to spend on them. And that doesn't mean that you can't sometimes involve and indulge yourself in luxury items, and that you're depriving your kids, but it just means that we have psychologically like a set point and an awareness. And I think we can talk to our kids about that too. Like, I could buy you the Hunter boots, but I've decided that this is what I'm willing to do. Another person he interviewed talked about having this aim to give their kid like the 30th percentile of their peer group. Now, obviously, if you live in like a really affluent area and your kids go to private school with people with private jets, the 30th percentile is going to be different than if you are in a more rural area with people who have lower incomes and your kids are going to public school. But the idea here is that we're probably better off as parents raising kids who mostly don't get everything that they want. They have enough. These are for the wants, right? Like, they have enough, they have some of it, but they don't have every new video game, every latest version of the iPhone, the brand new BMW when they turn 16, whatever it is. Like, the goal should be to give them some, but not all. And this is supported by psychological literature in terms of outcomes as well. And I'll talk about that in a bit. Another great part of the book was encouraging us to not limit our kids' exposure to commercials, but also to encourage that exposure when we're there to talk to them about it. So watch commercials with our kids and talk about how they are trying to get your money, how those advertisers are trying to convince you the message that they're trying to send. Because definitely kids, and we too, are susceptible to the messages that are sent. And he gives examples from research where they showed preschoolers videos about something like, I don't know, a Power Ranger, some makeup toy, right? Like, but it was a commercial for this toy. And then they asked the kids, like, if you were to play in the sandbox with a kid who had one of those, would you choose a nice kid or a kid is not so nice, but he has the toy? And the kids were more likely to choose a not nice kid who has the toy than they were to choose a nice kid who doesn't have the toy. So from a young age, the desires that are instilled in us from watching commercials can shape our behavior in a way that may not be to our benefit. And this is something that we should be talking to our kids about. All right. And then other parts that I really liked about the book were he talks about a woman who wrote a book about like all the stuff. She made a viral video about all the stuff, and now she's like a Greenpeace advocate, and she has a daughter. And so with her daughter, she's not super rigid about these things, but she just has a lot of conversations about the choices that she makes and how she can maximize the good and minimize harm. So, for example, they talked about her daughter wanted some jeans at Old Navy that are made in Bangladesh, would probably buy sweatshops, maybe employing children. And the kid knows this, but like all her friends had these particular jeans and they had a conversation about it. And that's what she wanted to do with her money. And the mom let her do it, even though she wasn't really in agreement. So again, we have to give up some control here, but the value is really in having the conversation so that the choices that we make and that our kids make about the stuff that we do buy and consume are thoughtful choices. Another great idea was to calculate the fun in hours to dollars spent ratio for any toy that your child wants. I thought this is pretty brilliant too. So they thought about this, these parents that they interviewed after one Christmas where the parents spent a lot of money on some toy that the kids played with, you know, for just a few minutes on Christmas Day and then kind of never revisited again. I think as parents, we can all relate to that. I know I've made that mistake before. And they came up with the fact that like the best fun to dollar ratio is probably like a deck of cards, because you pay what, $7 for this deck of cards. It can last you for years if you take care of it, and you can play countless games with it. But every game or toy kind of has this ratio, and you can think about it and you can have a conversation with your kids about it. Again, it doesn't have to dictate like a hard line, but it just is raising their awareness and their thoughtfulness about their purchasing decisions. And then also he encourages us to remember that we are the parents and we can decide, even when our kids have their own money, what is off limits. So if you don't want your child to be, you know, running around and exposing clothing or playing violent video games or riding a motorcycle, whatever it is, you can decide as the parent and be explicit with your kids what they can and can't buy. And this might include things like smartphones. And then finally, I think this is the final slide in this, dealing with the give me attitude, which is just part of our current society, right? I mean, there's just so much more stuff now than there was even when we were growing up. So he encourages us to give them agency. And I thought this was a pretty brilliant idea. If you're going to a family vacation, say like Disneyland, Disney World, some amusement park, something like that, where you know your kids are going to be clamoring to buy them stuff, consider giving them a prepaid debit card or cash budget that's theirs to use on that vacation, and then letting them make a choice about how they're going to spend their money. When you put it in their hands, that decision, then you eliminate the like, can I have this? Can I have this? Annoying conversations that are going to happen with every gift store that you pass. And you encourage them to be thoughtful about how they want to spend their money. And you encourage them to have patience to practice looking at all the things that they could do before they make their final decision. And also they talked about giving older kids a budget for school, talking about giving kids, my parents did this to me one year too, like a budget that was for their school shopping, so that encourages them to shop in less expensive places, to stretch their dollars further. But you step back, and if, you know, ultimately they decide to spend $200 on a pair of fancy Nikes or $150 on a pair of designer jeans, and then they don't have enough money to buy other clothes, well, you're going to have to deal with that, but you don't have to bail them out. You can just be like, well, what do you think about that decision you made? And what are you learning from this? And then ultimately, I remember my freshman year of high school, my dad gave me the money to buy my clothes. I bought my clothes, and then I grew 6 inches that year. And thankfully, they were understanding of the fact that like my shirts were up to here and my pants were all high water. And they did take me shopping a second time in that year because I was the oldest child. There were no hand-me-downs for me to grow into. And I think we have to be flexible. But again, if you don't give your kids that opportunity, they miss that learning experience, right? So again, it's about embracing failure, which is one of the 4 pillars of empowered parenting that I teach in my course. Let your kids fail, let them screw up with their money when the stakes are low, when they're under your roof, when they can come back to the safety of you and learn a lesson without having it be something that is shame-inducing or the end of the world. The consequences will be less while they're under your roof than they will be when they're in their 20s and they have a huge credit card. Okay, then continuing on this vein about dealing with consumerist society and culture, we don't want to discourage our kids' big wants, but we don't want to totally foot the bill for them either. I'll give you a little story from my clinical practice a few years ago. I had a young patient, he was probably like a freshman in high school, I think, and he was at a private school in Los Angeles. And he came in just baffled because there were some kids whose parents were just buying them whatever they wanted like that. And he told me there was a kid sitting next to him in class who texted his mom. The hot thing then was, I think they were called Yeezys. It was Kanye West's sneaker line. And somebody showed up to school with them, and his friend texted his mom, and he just sent the text like, "Mom, Yeezys." And his mom wrote back on it. And the next day the kid had Yeezy sneakers. You don't want to be that parent. Like, we don't want to be the parent who is instantly satisfying our kids' every urge, because that just teaches them the opposite of what we're trying to teach them, right? Like, it doesn't teach them anything about persistence or patience or gratitude. You miss that opportunity entirely. And you're much more likely to end up with a child who then acts like a spoiled child than you are one who doesn't, if you indulge in that way, even if you're able, right? So when your kids have an indulgent desire, and he gives examples in the book of a girl who wanted to do horse showing, which I guess is very expensive. I've never even ridden a horse. I know nothing about that, but he also talks about kids who are involved in sports. Again, I know a little about this because my kids are mathletes, not athletes, but if you have a kid who's in a sport, you probably know how expensive it can be with all the travel and the equipment and everything. Travel, and then college, of course, is a huge expense. So if our kids have these wants, we don't want to discourage them and tell them that they're bad for wanting things, even if they're expensive, even if they're out of our financial reach. We want to help them solve their funding problem and help them be part of that solution. We shouldn't be part of the solution. Well, we can be part of the solution, but we shouldn't be the whole solution, even if we can. And all of this is supported by outcomes data and psychology research. Basically, when we pay for things, we value it more. We have skin in the game. And this is true for kids too, right? They need to be the driver of their choices and to have participated in making it happen in order to feel pride at the accomplishment in the end. They will feel more pride if they made it happen themselves by doing something and working towards it. And this is shown in colleges. Kids have better grades if their parents foot less of the bill. This correlation, it turns out, decreases at really high tier colleges, but it's still there. So again, like, when you're responsible in some way for paying your college, you're more likely to do well. And this idea was supported by the research in the book, The Millionaire Next Door. It's a great read if any of you are interested in it. Again, it's an old book, but it's still really interesting to read it. And the idea is that even if you have a lot of money, even if you can support your kids, you shouldn't, because there's value in learning how to do this for yourself. And then a little bit in contrast to that, but not completely. Sorry, I'm getting a message that my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully y'all can still hear me. A little bit similar to that is this book, Die with Zero. I forget the author's name, Brian something, but his idea is that people should be thoughtful about giving their money to their children and their adult children when it makes a difference in their lives, rather than waiting until they're dead. So the average age at which an adult inherits something, or a person inherits money from a parent who dies, is 60. And he talks about all these situations where, like, by then most adult children don't really need the money, but earlier in their life, like when they got a divorce at age 40 and suddenly they went to be single income with 2 young kids, that is the time in their life when they really could have used some money from their parents. So he encourages us as parents to, again, this is a book written for affluent families, right? But think about, if you're in a place where you're going to be giving your kids some money, why wait until you're gone to give them that money? Same to charities, like wait until you're gone. Like, give it now and experience the joy of giving now and the benefits of giving now. So that's a little bit of a side note, not really related to this book. All right, I think this is very interesting. He talks in the book about, are teens working? And the answer is so many fewer teens are working now. And I guess I know this just from seeing it. It's interesting. I live in Los Angeles, where I see very few teenagers working. This summer and the last few summers, I'm in New Hampshire, where it's much more common for kids to work, and they can work starting at the young age of 14. So sometimes I go to the grocery store and there's literally like a 14-year-old checking me out. Or you see this kid who looks so young and he's wearing a badge like, I've been working here for a year. And you're like, how is that possible? But, I was in high school from 1991 to 1995. So way back here. I'm so old, but at that time it was pretty common, and a lot of my friends worked, and I worked a part-time job in high school as well, especially once I had my license. I worked in the summers before I had my license from 14 on. But you can see this has dropped dramatically, like huge drops. During the pandemic, it dropped a lot. This doesn't continue. It's actually come up a little bit. The latest data from 2023 was even a little bit higher. So it seems like Gen Z is coming back to work more than the prior generations. And interesting, kids from higher income families seem to be more likely to have a part-time job than kids from lower income families or kids on welfare, which I would guess that's probably because the kids on welfare are more needed at home to care for younger siblings, but I'm not really sure about the data. I didn't dive into that too much. Should teens work? I think the answer is yes in almost all cases, but parents tend to worry about kids' academics. Are they still going to have time to study? You know, a lot of wealthy families have high achieving or high expectations, high achieving kids. And the truth is that kids have time. There's plenty of time. If you're talking about a part-time job that's like a couple hour shifts a couple times a week, they'll be able to squeeze that in. Parents worry about competitiveness for colleges, and he does discuss and talks with like director at MIT for admissions and says that competitive colleges truly are competitive, but teaching kids the value of work is invaluable. So, you know, yeah, if it's going to mean the difference of your kid earning some international recognition for something they're really into, maybe you're better off doing that so they can get into MIT or Harvard. But if your kid is more of a great but more averagely great person, then probably teaching them the value of hard work is going to help them more in their lifetime than gambling on getting into an Ivy League school, because that admissions process is not a meritocracy, as we know. And then parents also worry about a downward slide. If you're an affluent parent, you worry, you know, what if my kid ends up being poor? What if they don't make nearly as much money as I do? Well, first of all, if you're an affluent family, you need to realize that there's a big difference between being poor and where you're at. But the truth is that, you know, this is the problem in our society and the problem with wealth concentrating in certain populations. Basically, if you're a wealthy family, your child's more likely to be wealthy. Statistically, for families in the top 10% of income, fewer than 20% of them, their children ended up as adults under the 50th percentile of income. So already, if you are a family that has means and a lot of income, then your kids are more likely to come out ahead, and having a part-time job is not going to hurt that, most likely. All right, so talking a little bit more about family values and money. Last week or the week before, I created a new Typeform quiz that any of you can do. And it's here, theparentdoctor.com/mission statement. It's free. At the end, what it does is it emails you the summary of your results and gives you a ChatGPT prompt that you can then take and type into ChatGPT to summarize for you your family mission statement. And this is what my family got. We got that we value creativity, love, and fun. We strive to make everyone feel loved and elevated. We cherish our time together, creating happy memories. And we uphold these values with cheerfulness, flexibility, and generosity. Now, I have to tell you, it relates to money because of the generosity piece. This specifically doesn't go too much into like what we do with our money, and that's a conversation we still need to have. My kids, you can see them, are 11 and 7. But we went the week after we did this exercise to a local amusement park here in New Hampshire called Storyland. My 7-year-old and 11-year-old were in line to play this game where you roll the ball and it drops into one of the holes, and then your little guy goes faster or slower across to see who wins the race. And it was, I think, $6 per test, and there were 9 slots. So you had a 1 in 9 chance of winning a prize. Well, my son looks at what the prizes are. There's a whale, I think, and a pig. And he's like, I need that pig. So we're waiting in line. It's super hot. My daughter's waiting too. And I'm just thinking, oh, here we go. You know, they're both going to be upset. Why am I doing this to myself? Like, why am I going to spend this money? But my son then got distracted and he went and rode a roller coaster. So I did the game with my daughter when our turn came. And lo and behold, she won. So I was happy for her, but I was also feeling dread because I know how these things go down with 2 kids. I was worried that my son was going to come back, see that she won the prize he had wanted, and be furious. And then he was going to want to play the game. And I was probably going to let him play the game and spend more money than I wanted to. And it was just going to end up in this whole mess. I knew that's how it was going to go. But to my surprise, my daughter, who when we did the mission statement was like really tired, we did it late at night. She was not, didn't seem to be listening at all. She gets the pig, she gives it a big hug. I tell her like, oh, that's so exciting. I'm really happy for you. And she looks at me and says, I'm going to give this to Calvin. That's her older brother's name. So I was so surprised. I really think that because we did this exercise and we talked about the importance of generosity and cheerfulness and flexibility and how those are our main values as a family, that she embodied that. Like it got through to her. When we talk explicitly to our kids about these things, they are listening. That's my point. So please consider doing this exercise. It's not particularly about money, but I think it's a helpful one. It's free and I've made it. And so I want more people to enjoy it. We can use money to build gratitude. He talks about a lot of cute stories in this. One family, their preschooler just would say gracias as like a grace before their meals in preschool. And they started the habit when their kid was young and they continue it now. And they talked about how they hold hands and they just say gracias. And that's all they do. They're not a very religious family. They don't go to church, but it's a moment, just a pause to be thankful, to be together. And I think that's a very beautiful ritual. He encourages us to tell our kids that story and then encourage them to come up with the ritual for our family, whatever it is. He talks about the habit of taking a picture each day with your phone of something you're grateful for and how this can be a really wonderful exercise to do, especially when your child gets their first smartphone, to make sure that they are using it for good. And then he talks about symbolic deprivation, and he gives examples of summer camps. 2 of them were in Maine, close by where I am now, where kids basically get sent away by their wealthy families to be without everything for a summer and how that impacts them. He talks about outreach, like sending your kids on mission trips and things like that, and the pros and cons of that. And then he discusses families choosing to take lower cost vacations. And I could relate to that because he talks specifically about the 4 seasons. I told you my parents growing up made max, I think about $70,000 combined. My first manicure was when I was 21 going to a wedding. I still remember looking at my toes, my pedicure, and just being like, wow, that's amazing. But we had the opportunity to go to my friend's 50th birthday party in Half Moon Bay, California, a few years ago. Let's see, it was 6 years ago because my daughter was an infant, no, 7 years ago. And my son was 4. And my husband wanted to stay at the Four Seasons Half Moon Bay because we were going to be doing brunch there for my friend's birthday. And that was going to be kind of the meeting place. And we could afford it. And I looked at it and then I was like, you know what? No, I refuse. I'm sorry. I'm not going to let my son's like first or one of his first like major hotel stays be at the Four Seasons when I'm like 40 years old and I've never stayed at a Four Seasons. So we stayed at some, nice, fine, but like much cheaper hotel in the Bay Area and drove like a long distance to go to this family event. But he discusses how like, for us as parents, especially for affluent parents, like going to a resort where you call for room service or get bottle service by the pool or whatever, it may be a huge incentive because we just want to relax and unwind from our busy jobs. But then our kids might go to a vacation where like the motel has a Coke machine where you can feed it quarters and get a soda, and that's going to be just as exciting for them. And so giving our kids these experiences at different levels of the cost hierarchy is really valuable. And we shouldn't be judgmental about people who can not afford the higher end things. We should enjoy them if we want to, but we should also not be afraid of having some symbolic deprivation and realizing that it's all good, right? Like we can have fun at every level of the economic hierarchy. All right, so this will be in your PDF, some conversation starters to have with your kids, some questions for us to ask ourselves as parents and talk to our kids about. One is, what was one big purchase you made that you regretted? Another is, what's a splurge that you're thankful for that you indulged in and cherish, or that you cherish the memory of to this day? And this reminds me of that book, Die with Zero. He talks in it about a friend of his who actually took out a loan from a loan shark to be able to take a long backpacking vacation. They were both working together as like traders on the floor in Wall Street, not earning much money in their early 20s. But in his early 20s, he had this amazing summer experience of like backpacking through Europe, and he met a girl and fell in love and has this wonderful memory of it. And now they're still friends in their 40s or 50s. And his friend has no regrets about taking out that loan from the loan shark in his 20s to do that. And he does have regrets that he didn't do it because he waited until he was older. But he's like, when you're in your 30s and you have the cash to do it, backpacking through Europe is not the same experience that it would have been when you were 21 years old. And for me, I think of our wedding day. At the time we were planning it, it felt really stressful. We were residents, we didn't have a lot of money. It felt like a big splurge, in the grand scheme of things. I don't know, it was probably in the 50th percentile. It wasn't a crazy wedding, but it felt like a big splurge. But that day was totally worth it. I completely cherish the memory and I have no regrets about the money we spent on it. And questions for your family. The big question that he kind of ends the book with is this question of how much is enough? And that's something that we all have to decide for ourselves, right? And one suggestion he makes, which may, again, make your stomach turn, but if you're up for it, review your credit card bills with your kids or review them yourself and look at the categories of spending. How much do you spend in different categories, on eating out, on recreation, on clothing, on travel, on different things? And does that reflect your values? And if not, how can you change things so that they do? Are your values aligned with your spending? All right, another really important part of the book was the importance of giving. He talks about how when kids are asked, how do your parents give, how much, and in what ways do they give? Most kids have no idea. And that doesn't mean that their kids aren't, or that their parents rather, are not contributing to charities or doing things for their communities or donating money. But the kids just don't know because the parents aren't talking about it. So he really encourages us to talk with our kids about that. And he gave a few ideas that I thought were cute. One is a 12 checks idea. This mom gave both of her sons 12 checks written out in certain amounts of money, and they were blank in the to. And so it taught the kids how to write a check. Again, a little dated, right? I don't know if my kids really need to know how to do checks, but I have done this with my kids before. We've made donations, have them fill out the check to learn that. But to give her teenage sons, like, I don't know how much she gave. It doesn't really matter how much. It's the idea of making the choice themselves which charitable organizations they want to donate to. And they actually look at all the flyers and solicitations that they get in the mail together as a family and decide, like, does it make more sense to give to this or to this? Then the bean budget idea that I showed earlier actually in the book was related to a family talking about their giving. And they discussed, like, this is how much we give with a pile of beans, like 100 beans. And then they gave so many to this thing and so many to this thing. And then they gave the daughter 5 out of 100 beans, and she could decide what to give them to. She was very young, like 5 or 6 years old. And they plan to increase the number of beans that she has to give, which represent dollars in a ratio later as she gets. And then he talks about one family that took things to an extreme. He says that they were very affluent. They were living in a house with over 7,000 square feet, worth millions of dollars. And their daughter came home and she was a teenager and really getting kind of self-righteous about things. And the mom questioned her and said, like, well, what do you want us to do? Like, sell our house and move to a smaller house and give away the money? And she said, yeah, that's exactly what I think we should do. And so the parents, to their amazing credit, like, they thought about it and they decided and talked about it as a family, and they actually did that. They sold their house. They moved to a house less than half the size. And then with the $1 million profit that they had, they, as a family, decided what they were going to do. And they decided that the 4 of them together were going to have equal say, that it had to be a project that they would see through to completion. And they ended up building 2 sort of community centers in Africa that did lending to small businesses and education and healthcare. And then they made a trip there and they saw how farmers worked there. And they basically talked about what a difference it made in their lives and how they weren't on a bad path. They weren't doing anything wrong the way that they were living before, but making that choice. And, obviously they were affluent enough that giving that $1 million of equity that they had in their home away didn't negatively impact their lives in any dramatic way. And they feel like they got more as a family out of making that, cut back living on half decision than they would have continuing to live in their way that they were. All right, so here's the problem with materialism. It's not the stuff per se, but the problem is that materialism leads to depression and unhappiness. When we are focused on what we don't have and what we want, we're less happy than we are if we are giving and practicing generosity. So even if you can't afford the latest and trendiest of everything, your child doesn't need those things. And the reason to not give it to them is not to teach them a lesson or, to teach them the hard way. It's so that they'll be happier people. And it's important also because our kids have to learn from us, their parents, the people who love them the most in the world, that they can be loved. They are loved. They live in a world that is inherently good. And yet they live in a world that will not give them everything they want all the time. That is true, right? All those things are true. And as a psychiatrist, I can tell you, having worked at residential treatment centers for teens and young adults with substance use issues, I would say this is the most common path: a parent's inability to tolerate their child's distress and to try to right all of their, to basically give them everything they want, to make everything right, every disappointment, every, situation, to turn it around to the child's benefit. those kids are the ones who are most likely to end up with a substance use disorder. Again, not all of them, but it's just, if you don't learn that you can live in a world that is good with people who love you and still not get what you want all the time, and learn to build your tolerance of that and feel that that's not dangerous, that's actually secure, you're going to be a much happier individual. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that kids today versus in my generation, I think reality TV just came out with like The Real World when I was in high school or early college, but kids today are exposed to so much more affluence above their socioeconomic level, regardless of where they are, right? So we see all this reality TV of people in their mansions, driving their fancy cars, the Kardashians, everything else. We see social media, everybody posting their best lives all the time. This leads to a lot of upward comparisonism. Is that a word? Upward comparison. And it feeds our materialism, which is a natural human desire. And he talks about basically teaching the solution to our kids with creative solutions, like the birthdays, bar mitzvahs, and holidays, valuing experiences more than things. He talks about a school that had this thing, they called it the 7th grade project. Collectively, the parents realized there's 33 kids in this class. If we all go to birthday parties for all these kids, because they were inviting all of each other, and we all spend like 20 to 30 bucks, we're going to spend, I think it was somewhere close to like 22 grand this year on these kids' birthdays. What if we pool that money, distribute amongst the kids, they all get some cash, and then we give the kids the opportunity to give that remaining $11,000 to the community with people who come in and bid for their donations. And this project became something that's lasted at the school. And I think that's so beautiful. It gives kids the opportunity to decide collectively and make gifts to their community with money that otherwise would have just been spent on birthday toys, many of which are just not played with, not used, go in a landfill. So I really love that idea. And then he talks about tooth fairy and in these kinds of situations. He talks about lots of creative ways other than just being materialistic and trying to make sure you're giving the right amount of cash with the tooth fairy, that your tooth fairy is like, on par with the neighborhood, that you can have a creative tooth fairy who maybe brings teeth from all kinds of animals or splitter dust with coins from different countries, things like that, that aren't necessarily just about the money. All right, so this is the last slide, conclusions and key takeaways from the book. Basically, allowance is a great way to give you opportunities to teach your kids about money and to learn through practice values that are important to you and to your family. Kids are naturally curious and they're going to ask questions, and we want to foster that. We don't want to discourage that. We don't want to lie. We want to be open and answer their questions as directly as possible in age-appropriate ways. But the one question we should always ask in response to any question that's uncomfortable about money is, oh, why do you want to know that? In a curious and inviting tone, because that will help us see where our kid is coming from and help us understand what's driving the question. And we want to use that then as a stimulus to enforce and discuss values. Thirdly, materialism leads to depression and unhappiness. We know this. Again, that's not saying stuff is bad. It's just like being focused on stuff and thinking like, I'll be happy when I get a job that pays me X amount. I'll be happy when I get a car that's this brand, whatever it is. You're depriving yourself of happiness in this moment, and all of us deserve to feel peace and joy and bliss and happiness in every moment. And we can, it's just a matter of shifting our perspective. So don't just talk about this idea of generosity, which we know leads to more joy and more abundance and great gratitude, gratefulness. Lead by example with your actions, with talking with your kids about your family's money, how you spend that money, what you give to, how you spend your time, where you donate your things. How much you give predicts happiness as much as your income. So really coming from a place of abundance rather than a place of scarcity, no matter how much you make, sharing in every opportunity that you can, and with everyone you can, is going to make you and your kids happier people. Encourage hard work as a means to reach financial goals. Don't discourage your kids from wanting things or having financial goals or material goals that cost a lot of money, but encourage them to come up with the solution themselves so that they have buy-in, they have skin in the game. And then spend time challenging your own money beliefs. I promise you have some. We all have hangups from our childhoods, from the families we were raised in, from our beliefs about money and what it means to have money or not have money. And in the PDF, the actionable PDF that I'm going to give you for today, you'll be able to work through some of those. And as parents, it's important that we work through those ourselves so that we can be conscious of our unconscious biases and our wounding historically about these ideas and topics, so that when our kids ask us, why are you a teacher and not Jeff Bezos, we can answer that in a way that feels comfortable and confident. We can recognize that like we made the choices we make because of who we are and because of the things that we value. And no one's value is determined by how much money they have. All right, guys, I hope this was helpful to you. Please email me, hello@theparentdoctor.com, if you have any suggestions for 2025 books. And I am looking for people to interview on my podcast for season 2. So shoot me an email there as well. In fact, I'm going to put up on my website later this week a link where you can book a time to talk with me if you'd like to be on my show in the future. So take care. Talk to you soon. Bye.